I'll never forget the sound of the sirens on that cold October morning. It felt like the sky itself was crying with me. I woke up to the police knocking at the door, and before I could understand what was happening, my world collapsed. They say life can change in the blink of an eye, and, in that instant, mine ceased to be mine. I could only think of Emily, my 5-year-old girl, sleeping peacefully in the next room, unaware that in a few minutes everything she knew would be taken from her. I remember trembling hands reaching for the Bible on the bedside table, praying to God it was just a nightmare. But it wasn't. The officers came in, opened every drawer, searched every corner of the house. I saw the suspicious glances, the hurried questions, the notebook that marked my sentence even before any trial. And, in the midst of it all, a body on the living room floor, the body of Michael, my husband. Can you imagine what it's like to be treated like a criminal when the only crime you committed was loving the wrong person? I tried to scream, to explain, but the words came out as weak murmurs. One of the police officers looked me in the eye and coldly said, "You are under arrest for the murder of your husband." And that's how my life, which had once revolved around childish laughter and simple family dinners, turned into an abyss of pain and despair. Before continuing, I want to say that I ask God to bless you with all His infinite love, giving you much health, peace, joy, and faith, because we can never lose faith in God, for He will never abandon us, because His love is eternal and infinite. I also take this opportunity to ask you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. This helps me a lot, thank you. That same morning, as they took me away in handcuffs, I saw Emily crying at the gate, her little arms outstretched, screaming, "Mommy!" It broke me into 1,000 pieces. I tried to tell her I would come back, that everything would be all right, but I knew I couldn't promise something that might never happen. As the police car drove away, my only prayer was, "Lord, protect my daughter. Don't let her grow up believing I'm guilty." During the drive to the police station, memories flooded back like a jumbled film. Michael's laughter, Emily's birthday cake, Sundays at church, the smell of fresh coffee in the morning. Everything seemed so distant now, almost as if it belonged to another life. And, in a way, it did. Because, on that day, Laura Benson, the mother, the wife, and the dedicated teacher, ceased to exist, giving way to the woman the world believed to be a murderer. But there's something I've learned over time. The truth, however buried it may be, always finds a way to breathe. And what nobody knew was that what would bring this truth to light wouldn't be an expensive lawyer, nor an unexpected confession, but the innocent drawing of a little girl. That morning, the sun seemed shy, hiding behind the clouds as if sensing what was to come. I woke up early, as I always did, to make coffee and get Emily ready for kindergarten. Michael was still sleeping on the sofa, which was nothing new. He spent entire nights out and, when he returned, always had a strong smell of alcohol and regret. Even so, I believed that love and faith could change anyone. Emily ran up to me in her pink pajamas, hugging my legs and asking if she could take her plush bunny to school. I smiled and said yes, without imagining that this would be the last genuine smile she would see on my face for a long time. There are times when the heart senses something, but reason refuses to listen. While I was making coffee, I heard a strange noise coming from the living room. A dry, metallic sound, as if something had fallen to the floor. I went over and saw Michael with his back to me, holding something. Before I could ask, he turned around, and his gaze was empty, distant, almost frightening. "Laura, we need to talk," he said, his voice trembling. That sentence seemed innocent, but there was a tension in it that I had never felt before. The smell of alcohol was strong, and his eyes were red and watery. He started talking about debts, dangerous people, things I didn't understand. I tried to calm him down, said we could solve everything together, that God wouldn't abandon us. But he didn't seem to listen. Suddenly, he yelled something about ending it all, and stormed out the back door. I stood there for a few seconds, not knowing what to do. I picked up the phone, thought about calling the pastor, but decided against it. Minutes later, I heard a scream, a sound I'll never forget. I ran to the backyard and saw him lying there, motionless. There was blood. So much blood. Despair overwhelmed me. I tried to revive him, screamed for help, ran into the street begging for assistance. The neighbors approached, frightened, but no one dared to get close. When the police arrived, I was already covered in blood, holding his body and begging God not to take him. But, to them, that scene said something else. They asked if Michael and I had argued. They asked about the reason, about our history of arguments, about the nights he spent out. Each of my answers seemed to sink me deeper. I spoke of love, they heard hate. I spoke of faith, they wrote down lies. And when they found the knife in the kitchen sink, everything was decided. The interrogation was long, cruel, and cold. I kept saying I hadn't done anything, that someone must have broken in, but they didn't believe me. They said there were my fingerprints on the knife. Of course there were. It was my kitchen. But who would listen to reason when the whole town had already decided I was guilty? That night, while waiting for the public defender to arrive, I closed my eyes and tried to pray. I asked for strength, I asked for justice. But deep down, something inside me told me that this fight would be much bigger than I imagined. I just didn't know it would last more than a decade. In that cold cell, surrounded by gray walls and distrustful stares, I could still hear Emily's voice calling to me. And it was that voice, pure, innocent, full of hope, that would keep me from going insane. Because, even without understanding, I felt that one day, somehow, the truth would find its way back. And when she came in the hands of a child. The following days were like an endless nightmare. I remember sitting before the judge, my hands trembling and my heart breaking, trying to understand how my life had become a police case. Everything I said seemed to backfire on me. The prosecutor painted a cruel picture, a jealous, desperate woman who had supposedly lost control. When I looked around, every face in the courtroom was judging me, even without knowing me. The worst part was seeing my mother in the last rows, holding Emily in her lap. The little girl was playing with a doll, oblivious to the horror of that place. I wanted to run to her, hug her, tell her that all of this was wrong. But the police officers beside me wouldn't even let me move. In that instant, I realized that my voice, my truth, and my freedom had been taken from me. The trial lasted only a week. 7 days to destroy a lifetime of love and honesty. The evidence was circumstantial, but convincing. They said the blood found on my clothes was Michael's, as if I hadn't tried to save him. They showed old messages between us, distorted, edited, used to prove a hatred that never existed. And, to make matters worse, an alleged handwritten confession mysteriously appeared. I yelled that the paper wasn't mine, that I had never written it, that the text was full of mistakes I would never make. But nobody wanted to listen. The public defender asked me to calm down, said we would fight it on appeal. But when the sentence was read, life imprisonment without parole, I knew my life as I knew it was over. The sound of the judge's gavel echoed like thunder. Emily began to cry in my mother's lap, calling for me. I wanted to run to her, but I was pulled back by the guards. It was worse than death. It was like watching my soul being forcibly ripped away while everyone remained silent. I wondered, where was God at that moment? The first nights in prison were endless. I lay on a hard bed, staring at the cracked ceiling and trying to convince myself that it wasn't real. The voices around me, the banging iron doors, the distant screams, it all seemed like an unjust punishment the world had decided to impose on me. But even there, I refused to hate. I wrote letters to Emily every day, even without knowing if she would receive them. Letters full of love, hope, and faith. I told her about the sunrise I saw through the small window of my cell and said that, like it, I believed a new day would come. I asked her to pray for me and never let her heart harden. As the months passed, I began to learn the unwritten rules of the prison. The older inmates watched me with curiosity, some with disdain, others with pity. One of them, named Marjorie, she approached me one night. She was a woman with gray hair and tired eyes. "Do you still believe in God?" she asked. I just smiled and replied, "He's all I have left." Marjorie became my confidant. She said I had a different kind of glow, that there was something about my faith that even scared the guards. Sometimes, when the lights went out, we would pray together. I would ask forgiveness for everyone, including those who had lied about me. Maybe it was madness, but it was my way of staying alive inside. Over time, I discovered that my mother was getting sick and that Emily was being raised by a distant family. That news devastated me. I felt like I was failing as a mother, as a daughter, as a woman. But at the same time, that pain gave me strength. If I couldn't be with Emily, at least I could fight for her, even from behind bars. I started studying law in the prison library. I read everything I could about appeals, evidence, and judicial injustices. I wanted to understand what had happened to me. It was there, among yellowed pages and sleepless nights, that I began to realize that something didn't add up in the evidence presented at my trial. The police reports contained contradictions, dates that didn't make sense, testimonies that seemed rehearsed, and, above all, a question that no one ever answered: why were the street security cameras turned off that particular night? The more I read, the more I understood that there was something much bigger behind my condemnation. It was as if someone wanted me to remain there, silent, forgotten. One day, I received a letter with no return address. Inside, there was only one handwritten sentence: "The truth lies in small hands." I was breathless. I didn't understand what it meant, but I felt a chill down my spine. Could it be some kind of sign? In the following nights, that phrase wouldn't leave my head. I repeated it so many times that it began to sound like a prophecy. The truth lies in small hands. And although I didn't know it yet, that would be the first whisper of the miracle God was preparing, coming not from lawyers, nor from judges, but from the purity of a child. Prison life is like a broken clock. Time passes, but it never seems to move forward. Every morning, the same clanging of metal, the same heavy footsteps, the same smell of disinfectant and despair. I learned to survive in silence. Every poorly chosen word could cause a fight, every glance could become a threat. I was no longer Laura Benson, the beloved teacher, Emily's mother. Inside, I was just number 14782. Even so, there was something in me that no one could imprison: my faith. I would pray softly, sometimes just moving my lips. And when the guards weren't looking, I would open my hidden Bible, its pages already crumpled, and read the Psalms in search of comfort. "The Lord is my refuge and my fortress." I repeated this every day, as if it were an invisible shield protecting me from despair. One afternoon, while helping in the laundry, I overheard one of the inmates commenting on something about me. She said it was dangerous to believe too much in God in here. I smiled, without responding. Because, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that when the world takes everything from you, God becomes your only refuge. And it was that faith that kept my mind standing during those dark years. But even faith wavers when silence is all that answers you. At night, I cried softly, trying not to make a sound. I thought of Emily, imagining how much she must have grown by now. Did he still remember my voice? Did she still call me Mom? The uncertainty gnawed at me more than the bars. From time to time, I would receive letters from my mother. The shaky handwriting was full of love and concern. She would say that Emily was doing well, that she was studying, that she liked to draw. These words gave me strength to continue. I imagined my little girl with colored pencils in her hand, drawing hearts, little houses, maybe even our old home. One day, while reading one of those letters, I felt something different. It was as if God touched my heart and said, "Hold on tight, Laura. The seed of truth has already been planted." I didn't know what that meant, but that feeling stayed with me. I began to look to the future with a glimmer of hope, even without understanding why. The days dragged on between work in the kitchen and long conversations with Marjorie. She would tell me, "God doesn't make mistakes, Laura. Sometimes He allows the desert to teach us to recognize the rain." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at that. But somehow, her words warmed me more than the thin blanket of the cell. There was also Janet. There was a younger girl with a hard look in her eyes who said she didn't believe in anything. One day she approached me and asked, "How can you still smile?" I replied, "Because smiling is the only thing they can't take away from me." She looked at me confused, but from that day on she started sitting near me during meals. I taught the women to read and write, using torn pieces of paper and short pencils. It was my way of transforming that hell into something a little more humane. Some laughed at me, others called me the saintly teacher. I didn't care. Each written word was a reminder that there was still life inside me. One night, while reading a verse, I heard a noise in the hallway. The lights flickered, and a female voice whispered my name, "Laura." I looked around, but I didn't see anyone. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but I felt a chill. Maybe it was my imagination, or maybe not. I've learned to recognize when something spiritual is about to happen. In the following days, I began to dream about Emily. In every dream, she appeared drawing. Always the same hand movements, always the same colors, red and blue. And there was always a male figure in the background, with a strange glint in his eyes. I would wake up sweating, with my heart racing. I didn't understand what it was trying to tell me, but I felt it was important. When Christmas arrived, the inmates organized a small mass. The chaplain spoke about forgiveness, about new beginnings. I cried the whole time, not for what I had lost, but for what I still believed I could recover. At the end, he approached me and handed me a small card with a phrase written on it, "Light always triumphs over shadow, even when we don't see it." I kept that card with Emily's photo. A short time later, I received the news I feared most. My mother had passed away. The world stopped. I knelt in my cell and cried until I had no strength left. Emily was now alone. Alone, but in God's hands. I prayed that someone good would take her in, that she would never let the pain transform her heart. That night, I looked out the small window and saw a star shining brighter than the others. I closed my eyes and asked for a sign. I asked God to show me, somehow, that He was still there. And, for the first time in a long time, I fell asleep peacefully. Unbeknownst to her, on the other side of the country, Emily, my daughter, now 7 years old, was also gazing at the same sky. And in her hands, as she drew at school, the miracle that would change everything was beginning to take shape. It was just another morning at a small school in Austin, Texas. The children were laughing, singing, and drawing. Emily, now 7 years old, sat near the window, her hair tied in 2 braids, her curious eyes observing the world outside. The teacher, Mrs. Collins, she asked each student to draw something important they saw and never forgot. It seemed like an innocent activity, but what Emily put on paper would change everything. With steady little hands, she began to draw a figure lying on the floor, a man with a knife beside him. The teacher approached and asked what it was. Emily calmly replied, "It's the man who hurt Daddy." Mrs. Collins paused for a moment, not knowing what to say. In the drawing, next to the man, there was something else, a tattoo on his arm, in the shape of a snake coiled around a cross. It seemed like a simple childish detail, but Mrs. Collins felt uncomfortable. Years of teaching had shown her when a child wasn't making things up, and Emily spoke with conviction, without hesitation. "He was angry, and Daddy fell. I called Mommy, but she was crying a lot." The teacher wrote everything down, without imagining that this moment would be the beginning of the turning point of an injustice buried for years. That night, when she got home, Mrs. Collins called social services and reported the incident. At first, no one paid much attention. Children make up stories all the time. But something about that drawing just wouldn't leave her head. The tattoo, a snake and a cross. It seemed familiar. In the following days, she showed the drawing to the principal, who decided to keep it in the file, fearing it would cause problems. But fate does not tolerate silence when the truth needs to be told. A week later, a local reporter, who was doing a story on childhood trauma, visited the school. Upon seeing the drawing, he was intrigued. "That tattoo. I've seen something like it before." A few days later, an image of Emily's drawing discreetly appeared in an online article about the expressions of children who had suffered family trauma. No one imagined that that small, colorful line would go viral. Within hours, thousands of people began commenting, trying to decipher the mystery behind the drawing. Among the comments, one in particular stood out: "This tattoo is identical to Tom Harris's. He lives here in Springfield. He was the one who testified against Laura Benson." The name rang like thunder. Laura Benson, the woman convicted of killing her husband, a case many still remembered. The same case that seemed to have been solved years ago. Meanwhile, Emily, not understanding the turmoil she had caused, continued drawing. For her, it was just an old memory, a scene that never left her mind. What no one knew was that on that fateful morning, hidden behind the curtain, she had seen the real killer, and kept the secret, unconsciously, in her childish mind. In prison, I still didn't know anything. But that week, I felt something different in the air. The inmates were talking about a miraculous drawing that was circulating on the internet, something about a girl and an old crime. Marjorie showed me an old magazine, and, on the cover, there it was, the face of a child with a colored piece of paper in her hands. My heart froze. It was her. It was my Emily. I picked up the magazine, my hands trembling. Tears welled up before I could even read the caption. Girl's drawing reignites doubts about Springfield murder case. For a moment, everything around me disappeared. I could only think that, perhaps, God had finally heard my prayers. That night, I knelt on the cell floor and cried like I hadn't cried in a long time. I thanked, grateful and desperate, for that small sign of hope. I knew the road would be long, that the system wouldn't easily admit its mistake. But if there was a beginning, it was there, in the small hands of a girl of faith. Outside, Mrs. Collins was receiving visits from journalists and county officials. They wanted to know more about the drawing. She repeated everything Emily had said. A veteran retired investigator who had followed the case years before fell silent for a while and murmured, "I remember that tattoo." It was the first glimpse of the truth. The name of Tom Harris started circulating again. The man who had testified against me, who swore he'd seen a violent fight between me and Michael. Now, everything pointed to him. And that tattoo, a symbol I'd never noticed before, was the key to what no one wanted to see. While the outside world was beginning to connect the dots, inside the prison the impossible was happening. Guards and inmates looked at me with respect. "She's your daughter, isn't she?" Marjorie asked, smiling with tears in her eyes. I just nodded, unable to speak. In that instant, I realized that the faith I had maintained throughout all those years had not been in vain. I knew the storm was only beginning, but inside my chest there was a burning certainty: the truth was alive. And it would come to light, even if the whole world tried to bury it again. The news spread faster than any lawyer could have predicted. Suddenly, the whole state was talking about the truth drawing. TV channels showed the colorful paper made by a 7-year-old girl, and child behavior experts discussed the meaning of each stroke. But behind the innocent colors lay a secret no one imagined, a tattoo that would change everything. In prison, I followed the news on the television in the common room. When I heard the name Tom Harris mentioned, I felt a chill. The same man who condemned me with his words, who claimed to be Michael's friend, who cried in court. Now he was the prime suspect. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was as if, suddenly, all the years of pain and humiliation began to make sense. The investigations have restarted. A young lawyer named Grace Miller, a recent graduate with a heart moved by faith, she decided to review the case on her own. She believed God was guiding her. "Nothing happens by chance, Mrs. Benson," she told me on the first day she visited me. "That drawing was a sign. And signs shouldn't be ignored." Grace began comparing old testimonies, forgotten files, and poorly filled-out reports. And it was she who found the first major contradiction. Tom Harris had said he was at home on the night of the crime, but a witness revealed that he saw him at a bar in the city around the same time Michael was killed. Coincidence? Perhaps. But God doesn't work with coincidences. He works with truths disguised as destiny. And then came the discovery that changed everything. The tattoo. The same snake coiled around a cross, identical to the one in Emily's drawing, appeared in an old photograph of Tom, taken the summer before the crime. That image, kept in a forgotten album belonging to his ex-girlfriend, became the undeniable proof. When that photo reached the prosecution, silence filled the room. The investigator in charge of the case, now retired, confessed that he had never seen that tattoo before, or perhaps he had preferred not to see it. Suddenly, everyone's certainties began to crumble. The city of Springfield, which had once condemned me without hesitation, was now beginning to doubt itself. Meanwhile, Emily, without understanding the magnitude of what was happening, continued going to school. When asked why she had drawn that man, she replied simply, "Because God showed me." That phrase spread throughout the country. Newspapers, blogs, and TV programs called her the girl who drew the truth. But, to me, she was just my daughter, the miracle who never stopped believing that her mother was innocent. In prison, the tension increased with each passing day. The guards watched me with curiosity. Some said I should sue the government, others murmured that God does justice in due time. I just prayed silently. I never asked for revenge, only for the truth. And now, it seemed that it was finally coming to light. Grace visited me again a week later, with a twinkle in her eye. "Laura, we found more than we bargained for," she said. She opened a folder full of documents. "The fingerprints on the knife aren't just yours. There's a second partial set, which has never been compared. And guess what? It belongs to Tom Harris. My whole body trembled. Tears came involuntarily. After so many years begging for someone to listen to me, justice was finally beginning to speak. But at the same time, something inside me was still afraid. I've seen the system fail before. And I knew that when the truth threatens power, it becomes dangerous. Indeed, it didn't take long for the reactions to begin. Some officials tried to discredit Grace's investigation. They said she was seeking fame, that the evidence was weak. But none of that mattered. Because, for the first time, there was something impossible to ignore, the testimony of a child who had nothing to gain, only the truth to tell. Emily was called in for another interview with psychologists and social workers. There, she described details she could never have invented: the man's voice, the sound of the fight, the metallic thud of the knife falling. When shown photos of different people, she pointed to Tom without hesitation. "It was him," she said, with the same serenity as someone recounting a memory that has never left her. This statement reached me through Grace. When she told me, I fell to my knees. I cried so much I could barely breathe. I knelt on the cell floor and thanked God for not letting me give up. And, for the first time in 12 years, the weight I carried on my shoulders began to dissolve. But the truth, when it emerges, is always accompanied by resistance. And Tom Harris was no ordinary man. He had influential friends, old connections, and secrets that could destroy many people. Grace knew this, but she didn't back down. "Laura, there is no darkness that can withstand the light of God," she told me firmly, holding my hand. I believed her. But what I didn't know was that this would only be the first step. Because, in unearthing Tom's tattoo, Grace had also unearthed something even darker, something no one was prepared to discover. On the morning I learned my case would be officially reopened, I didn't know whether to cry or laugh. After 12 years living like a shadow, that simple piece of paper signed by a judge was like a breath of fresh air. I pressed my hands to my chest and whispered, "Thank you, God. Thank you." On the other side of the bars, some prisoners clapped. Others wept with me. Even the guards seemed to touch the metal of the cell with silent respect. Grace came to visit me soon after, her face tired but her eyes shining. "We did it, Laura," she said, sitting down in front of me. "Justice will finally hear the truth." I hugged her with all my might. No words could explain what that meant. But deep down, I also knew this would be the beginning of a new battle, perhaps the most dangerous of all. The newspapers began covering the story as if it were a new national scandal. Wrongfully convicted woman may be exonerated after daughter's drawing. It was as if the whole country was sharing its breath with me. The cameras followed Grace's every move. Interviews with psychologists, lawyers, and even priests multiplied. Some called it a divine miracle, others said it was just coincidence. But I knew, there is no such thing as coincidence when the author is God. That week, the prosecutor in charge of my original case was called to testify. His face showed concern. Grace confronted him with old documents, pointing out inconsistencies in the evidence, missing evidence, and contradictions in Tom Harris's testimony. With each new question, his silence grew heavier. "How can you explain the disappearance of the street security footage?" she insisted. He looked away. Meanwhile, I waited anxiously in prison. The chaplain, a kind man named Father Matthews, he brought me a small wooden cross. "You'll need this now more than ever," he said. "The enemy fights harder when victory is near." I smiled, holding the crucifix as one holds hope. When the case was officially reopened, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, curious onlookers, and old acquaintances from the city filled the hall. Outside, women held signs saying, "Justice for Laura." Some of them were former students of mine, now adults, who had decided to fight for me. I heard this and cried. It's incredible how the good we plant, even in silence, blossoms when we least expect it. Tom Harris, on the other hand, tried to hide. At first, he denied everything. He said the story was absurd, that the drawing was manipulated. But the tattoo didn't lie, nor did the fingerprints. And, little by little, his mask began to crack. Grace managed to track down a former neighbor of his, who claimed to have seen him burning something in the yard that same night. The burning coincided exactly with the estimated time of the crime. When the judge authorized the formal reopening of the investigations, a new team of experts was appointed. They analyzed everything again: the knife, the bloodstains, the medical reports. And that's when the first sign of something very wrong appeared. The old reports had been tampered with. Words were changed, numbers altered, signatures forged. Grace took these findings to the press. The country was shocked. How could such a serious case have been handled with such negligence? The Springfield judicial system, once proud of solving the crime, was now the target of scandal. Those who had convicted me began scrambling to clear their names. During the hearings, I was escorted to the courtroom for the first time in over a decade. The cameras captured my every step. As I entered, I heard quiet applause for someone who had once been called a murderer. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I looked up at the ceiling, took a deep breath, and murmured, "All glory to you, Lord." Grace presented the new evidence. Emily's drawing, now framed, was in the center of the table. The jurors observed it as if it were a sacred document. And, in a way, it was. It was the symbol of the purity that evil tried to extinguish, but that God used to rekindle the light. In the following days, witnesses began to come forward. People who had remained silent out of fear now found courage. A former police officer came forward anonymously, saying he had been pressured to close the case quickly. Grace took notes, her gaze fixed. I could tell she wasn't driven solely by justice, but by purpose. Meanwhile, Emily, now famous without understanding why, watched everything on television, alongside her adoptive family. With each piece of good news, she smiled. With each injustice, she prayed. And every night, she asked God that her mother would come home. The innocence of that prayer was what moved the universe in my favor. But the enemy doesn't rest. Days later, Grace began receiving anonymous messages. Subtle threats, veiled warnings. "Leave the past buried," one of them said. I feared for her, but Grace simply replied, "You don't bury what God decides to resurrect." When she told me this, I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen since the days when I believed in miracles: courage. And, even though I was afraid, I knew the truth was near. Very near. But what none of us knew was that the final piece of this puzzle would come from where it was least expected, from the mouth of a man who had carried the weight of regret for years. A retired police officer, about to reveal the secret that had kept Springfield silent for over a decade. It was a gray afternoon when Grace received the call that would change everything. On the other end of the line, a hoarse and hesitant voice asked to meet her, away from cameras, away from curious people. It was Charles Morton, the former detective who had led the original investigation into my case. He lived in isolation, retired for years, and his eyes bore the weight of someone who slept little and remembered too much. Grace traveled to the small town where he lived, taking only a tape recorder and a notebook. The meeting took place on a park bench, under an old tree. Morton trembled as he lit a cigarette. "I should have spoken sooner," he said, "but at that time I had a family, young children, and fear." He began to recount everything. He said that, at the time of the crime, the police chief called him one night and gave him an order: "The case needs to be closed by Friday. Springfield can't appear unsafe." There was enormous political pressure coming from above: mayors, prosecutors, people with a lot to lose. They told me that the woman had a motive, had the evidence, fit the profile. It was just a matter of putting everything together. Grace listened in silence, her heart racing. Morton continued, "When we found the knife, it wasn't in the sink. It was put there later. And there was another partial print, male, that disappeared from the report before it reached the court." He paused for a long time, took a drag of his cigarette, and finished, "That print was Tom Harris's." Grace stood motionless. It was the confirmation she had hoped for, but hearing it from the person who had led the case was different. "Why did you do this?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. Morton lowered his head. "Because they promised me a promotion, a bonus, and threatened my family. I accepted the silence. But God hasn't left me in peace. All these years, I see that woman's face in my dreams. I need her to forgive me." When Grace told me everything, I broke down. I fell to my knees and cried, asking God to help me forgive. And He did. Because, despite all the pain, I knew that forgiveness liberates more than any sentence. That day, I wrote a letter to Mr. Morton. I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I too have been forgiven by a God who never gave up on me. His confession was officially delivered to the justice system. The entire country was in shock. Headlines read, "Retired police officer admits to fabricating evidence in case of life sentence." Springfield became a battleground between conflicting accounts, authorities, and old secrets. But the most frightening part was yet to come. As she delved deeper into the investigation, Grace discovered that Tom Harris had connections to the local drug trade, something no one had ever imagined. He was part of a network that used small businesses in the city as a front for money laundering. Michael, my late husband, had discovered everything and threatened to report him. That was the real reason for his death. And me? I was just the perfect piece for the cover-up. A devoted wife, powerless, without influence, easy to blame. Everything made sense now. What they called a crime of passion was, in fact, a planned murder, and I was the scapegoat. Grace, courageous as always, brought the new evidence to court. The judge read every document, every recording, every word of Morton's confession. And then, for the first time, he looked at me differently, not as a defendant, but as a victim. While the trial resumed, Tom Harris tried to flee. For 2 days, he was missing. The city was in an uproar. Until, finally, he was found in a cheap motel on the outskirts of Dallas, trying to scrape off the tattoo on his arm. That same tattoo, the snake and the cross, that had given him away from the start. At the police station, in front of the cameras, he tried to deny everything. He said the police officer was lying, that the evidence was false. But the truth could no longer be silenced. And when the prosecutor read aloud the recording of Morton saying, "He did it, and I helped him hide it," the silence was sepulchral. I was in the courtroom when I heard those words. I couldn't hold back the tears. The tears I had held back for 12 years finally reached the floor. The people around me began to applaud. Some shouted, "Justice!" I just closed my eyes and whispered, "Lord, your will is perfect." But there was still something no one knew. Something hidden in the shadows of Tom's past. A secret that not even Grace could imagine, and which, when it came to light, would transform that case into something even more devastating. Because the woman everyone believed to be a stranger in the story wasn't so strange after all. The new hearing began on a cold, quiet morning. The press packed the courtroom, but no one dared make a sound. Grace entered determined, Bible in hand, a simple but powerful gesture. She placed it on the table, as if to say without words, "Let the truth speak today." I sat right behind her, observing every movement, every breath. The judge asked that the next witness be called. It was Tom Harris. He was handcuffed, dejected, his face pale. His tattoo, now distorted by attempts to erase it, was still visible. He looked at me for a brief moment, and looked away. The silence was absolute. Grace stood up and, in a firm voice, began to ask questions. "Mr. Harris, do you confirm that you knew the victim, Michael Benson, for more than 15 years? Try. And he confirms that he was his partner in a company that, according to records, never officially existed?" Tom hesitated. I don't remember." Grace approached, opened an envelope, and took out an old photograph. "And does this refresh your memory?" In the photo, Michael and Tom appeared side by side, smiling, during a fishing trip. Behind them, a woman. For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. That woman was not Laura Benson. Era Sarah Harris, Tom's sister. Grace turned the photo towards the judge. "Your Honor, this is Sarah Harris, the defendant's biological sister, who lived with Michael Benson in the months leading up to the murder. Can you confirm this, Mr. Harris?" Tom paled. The veins in his neck bulged. "This has nothing to do with—" "It all makes sense," Grace interrupted, raising her voice. "Because she was the one who discovered you were embezzling money from the company. And when she threatened to tell the truth, you killed her. Michael tried to stop you, and ended up dead too. You covered up the crime and blamed Laura, knowing the system would destroy her." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor, stunned, tried to react. The judge called for order. I couldn't breathe. This was more than a revelation, It was an earthquake. Sarah, the woman I believed to be just a family friend. I knew her. She'd been to my house. Played with Emily. Grace continued, showing new documents, bank records, old messages, and a voice recording recovered from an old phone of Michael's. In the recording, he said, "Tom, I'm not going to lie to you anymore. Sarah doesn't deserve this. Laura doesn't know anything." The courtroom fell silent. Tom lowered his head. When he looked up again, there were tears. I didn't want it to end like this," he murmured. "But it was too late. The lies, the years of injustice, the lives destroyed, it was all there, exposed before the world." The judge sighed and declared, "This court recognizes that there is sufficient evidence to acquit Laura Benson and reopen the Harris case as a double homicide." Those words echoed like a liberation. I brought my hands to my face and wept. 12 years. 12 long years until I heard the sound of my freedom. Grace hugged me, crying along with me. "I told you that God doesn't make mistakes, Laura." And all I could do was repeat, "He is faithful. He is faithful." That same afternoon, while the newspapers displayed the headline, "Mother Acquitted After 12 Years Thanks to Daughter's Drawing," something even more moving was happening. Emily was waiting for me outside the courthouse. When I was finally free, with the sun touching my face and no bars between us, she ran to me. I held her in my arms, as one holds one's own heart. She smelled of childhood and hope. "Mommy, I knew God would bring you back." I laughed and cried at the same time. "And He used you for that, my love." But the story wasn't fully told yet. Because while everyone was celebrating, the police found a hidden safe in Tom Harris's old house. Inside, there were photos, letters, and a diary, proof that the corruption and manipulation went far beyond him. There were names of officials, politicians, and businessmen involved. Grace knew that this wasn't the end, but the beginning of a new battle. She told me, "The truth sets you free, Laura, but sometimes it comes at a high price." I smiled. "I've already paid the price. Now it's time to live." That night, I slept in a clean bed, without bars, for the first time in over a decade. The wind rustled against the window, and the distant sounds of the city seemed like a song. I picked up my Bible, opened it at random, and read, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And that's how I knew the nightmare was over. But, as in every story marked by pain, there was still something left to say. Because not everyone was willing to accept the light. And, when darkness feels it is losing, it attempts one last attack. I thought the worst was over. That, after 12 years of pain, shame, and unanswered prayers, I could finally breathe. But the truth, the truth rarely comes alone. Sometimes, it brings a shadow with it, something that requires even more faith to endure. A few days after my release, Grace approached me with a different look on her face. She was holding a thin folder, but her expression was heavy. "Laura," she said, "there's something you need to know. Something we found in Tom Harris's safe." My heart raced. For a second, I feared everything would fall apart again. She opened the folder and took out an old letter. The paper was yellowed, the edges worn. At the top, I recognized Michael's handwriting. My hands began to tremble even before I read it. The first lines tore me apart inside. "If anything happens to me, please take care of Emily. I wasn't honest with you, Laura. Before I met you, I had an affair with Sarah Harris. She got pregnant, but the baby wasn't born. Tom never forgave me. He swore that one day he would get justice in his own way." I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. My husband, the man I swore to love until the end, who had died in my arms, had betrayed me with the sister of the man who ruined my life. Everything was spinning. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. Grace tried to hold me, but all I could think was, "That's why. That's why he died." That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered around the house like a lost soul. Memories came flooding back in flashes. Michael's absences, the silent arguments, the glances that now made sense. I finally understood the reason behind so much fury, so much silence. His death wasn't just the result of greed or fear. It was the outcome of an ancient sin that had never been confessed. The next day, Grace called me. "Laura, there's one more thing." I took a deep breath. Tom's diary, talks about Emily. My body froze. What about my daughter? She hesitated. He believed that Emily could be Michael's daughter, yes, but he always suspected that Sarah had lied about the abortion. And the dates match up, Laura. It's possible that Sarah had the daughter, and that this child was put up for adoption. My heart stopped. I didn't want to believe it. Are you saying Emily might not be my biological daughter? Grace was silent. I'm not saying anything for sure. But we need to investigate. The tears came with a force I didn't remember possessing. I believed in God during 12 years of imprisonment, but at that moment, I confess, my faith wavered. I knelt on the floor and screamed, Lord, why? Why now? Why take away my ground after giving me back my air? But even in the deepest pain, there is a divine whisper. And that morning, between sobs and prayers, something inside me said, do not be afraid. The love that comes from me does not depend on blood, but on the heart. In the following days, Grace took the case to family court. DNA tests were done. The wait was torture. Every second felt like an eternity. And when the results arrived, I was shaking so much I could barely open the envelope. The words seemed to dance on the paper. Genetic compatibility, not confirmed. Emily was not my biological daughter. But at that moment, something extraordinary happened. I didn't feel anger, nor loss. I felt love. A love so pure and strong that it could only come from God. Because, even without sharing my blood, she was my daughter, the girl God entrusted to me, who saved me with a drawing, who brought the truth to light. The bond that united us was more sacred than any DNA. Grace cried with me. You're her mother, Laura. You always have been. I hugged her, tears mingling with gratitude. Yes, I replied, and nothing can change that. Not the lie, not time, not the hell we've lived through. The press tried to turn the case into a new spectacle, but I refused all interviews. Some truths are only for the heart. I kept Michael's letter and the test results in a wooden box, along with my Bible. They remind me that forgiveness is greater than pain. The following Sunday, I went to church with Emily. We sat in the front row. When the choir began to sing Amazing Grace, she held my hand and whispered, Mom, I asked God never to let us be separated. I smiled, with tears in my eyes. And He never will, my love. Never. At that moment, I realized that the truth, even the painful truth, is the final step before healing. And, finally, the cycle of darkness was beginning to close. But one last chapter was still missing. Because, however much human justice had been served, there was something that money, time, and law could not bring back, the lost years. And it was in that void between the past and the future that I found the ultimate miracle. On the morning the sun rose freely upon my face, I realized how much time is a gift. 12 years ago, I dreamed of seeing the sky without bars. Today it was there, blue, open, silent, as if God Himself were saying, Now, daughter, it's time to start again. Emily and I moved into a small house in Wichita Falls, Texas. It wasn't big, but it had everything we needed, a garden, a porch, and a swing where she spent her afternoons drawing. Sometimes I would watch her from afar, and each of her strokes reminded me of the path we had walked. The colored pencil that once revealed a crime now wrote hope. Returning to life outside prison wasn't easy. People still looked at me with curiosity, sometimes with pity. But I learned not to run away from those stares. They were merely a reflection of human ignorance, and I now carried within me the light of forgiveness. Forgiving, I learned, is not forgetting what they did to you. It's freeing yourself from the prison that hatred builds within the heart. I started giving talks in churches and schools, telling my story, not as a victim, but as a living testimony to God's faithfulness. People cried, prayed with me, and always said, Laura, you are proof that miracles exist. I smiled, but I knew, the real miracle wasn't the drawing, nor the freedom, it was the love that survived everything. Once, a woman asked me if I had forgiven Tom Harris. I took a deep breath. I said yes. That it took time, tears, and prayer, but I did. Because forgiveness, I explained, is not a favor we do for the person who hurt us. It's a gift we give ourselves, so that our soul can breathe again. I later learned that Tom had fallen ill in prison. I asked permission to visit him. Grace looked at me in surprise, but understood. I entered that cold cell and saw a broken, aged man, his eyes heavy with guilt. He couldn't look at me. "Why?" he murmured. I simply said, "Because God taught me that justice without mercy is only vengeance." He cried, and so did I. We prayed together. That moment marked the end of a cycle. I left there feeling light, as if I had left my chains on the concrete floor. Over time, I wrote a book about everything I'd been through. I called it The Drawing of Truth. I dedicated it to Emily, Grace, and even Marjorie, who had passed away in prison before seeing the end of my story. I wrote, "Faith is the bridge between what we experience and what we do not yet understand." Emily grew up knowing the whole truth, including about her origins. One day, she asked me, "If I'm not your blood daughter, why did God choose me to help you?" I replied, "Because he knew that true love doesn't depend on blood, but on purpose." She smiled, rested her head on my shoulder, and said, "Then I am your purpose." Today, when I look back, I don't see a story of tragedy, but of resurrection. Of a woman who lost everything, her freedom, her name, her family, and found in God the strength to forgive and move on. Because, in the end, faith is what remains when the world collapses. And sometimes, the miracle we ask for doesn't come to change the past, but to heal the heart it left broken. So, if you're listening to this story now, remember, God never forgets those who trust in Him, even when silence seems to be the only answer. And if one day life traps you in some cell, be it of guilt, fear, or sadness, remember to look to the sky and say, "Lord, set me free from within." Because the worst prison isn't made of iron. It's the one we build when we stop believing. And so it was that, from a child's pencil and a mother's faith, a miracle was born that no one could have foreseen. A miracle that began with pain, but ended in forgiveness. When I close my eyes and think about everything I've been through, I realize that pain, however cruel it may seem, can be the fertile ground where God plants the greatest miracles. What began as a tragedy, an unjust imprisonment, a destroyed life, has transformed into a testament to love and faith. That 5-year-old girl who drew a man with a tattoo didn't know she was also drawing the path to truth. And I, a lost mother, learned that forgiveness is the only key that opens the doors to true freedom. Today, when I look at Emily, I see living proof that divine love doesn't need to be explained, it only needs to be lived. Because God doesn't choose the strong, He strengthens the chosen. And when the world says, "It's over," He whispers, "the story isn't finished yet." And that's why I want to leave you with a question, since you've made it this far. Have you forgiven the person who hurt you, or do you still carry invisible chains in your heart? What would you do if you discovered that the truth that will set you free comes from the most unexpected hands? Think about it. Sometimes, the forgiveness you avoid is the miracle God is waiting to begin. Before I go, I want to thank you for listening to my story. And, from the bottom of my heart, I pray that God blesses you with light, courage, and peace. May He heal your wounds and transform every tear into a lesson. And if this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications and share with someone who needs to remember that hope never dies, because God's love is eternal.